So many newcomers to Unitarian Universalism are surprised to discover that Unitarianism is an old tradition. Its roots go deep. The religious tradition began in Europe just a little under 500 years ago. And while Unitarianism flourished in England and in Poland, it put down its deepest roots in Transylvania. Transylvania had a Unitarian king, and there are many surviving churches that have stood there for 500 years. It's a surprising detail, and one that I will explore more in my newcomers orientation after the service today. So if you are new or have been around a long time and just want to learn more, please do come to that orientation. Unitarianism is not most people's first association with Transylvania. It certainly wasn't mine. I admit that my association was a bit more fanciful. When I was a youth in my church's youth group in Cincinnati, we were invited to the all-church Transylvanian dinner. This is an annual event designed to raise money for the Unitarian churches in Transylvania. My home congregation is one of the most active in trying to raise money for those churches. And that year, two special guests, the minister of a Unitarian church in Transylvania and his wife, were in attendance. The scent of herby, savory food wafts through the large social hall that is packed with people from wall to wall. A violin quartet serenades the audience. It is an exquisite setup. As a part of the evening, the guests are asked to write down questions that will be asked to the Transylvanian minister and his wife. And as the dinner comes to an end and people have had their fill, the main organizer rises and takes the microphone. She thanks everyone for coming and for supporting the churches and announces that thousands have been raised for those churches in Transylvania. She then introduces the minister and his wife and reminds us that they have offered to take questions. And so she opens the first slip of paper containing the first question. Have you ever seen Dracula's castle? The couple from Transylvania look perplexed. The minister explains in a thick accent that they do not know who Dracula is. The questioner moves on to the next question. Are people in Transylvania afraid of Dracula? The couple explains again that they do not know this Dracula person. The next question is this. Do you live in a town near Dracula? The poor couple at this point are starting to look annoyed. And the questioner, now catching on that she should probably stop asking questions about Dracula, opens up the next question, scrunches up her face, and then puts it aside. She does that to at least 5 more. Apparently, the majority of questions written down by attendees are about Dracula. The minister does finally have a good sense of humor about it, and towards the end he says, "This Dracula person is not ours. He's yours." So why is he ours? Why vampires? Margot Adler, a journalist for National Public Radio, who also happens to be a Unitarian Universalist, underwent a self-described 4-year obsession with vampire literature. When she tells her friend that in the course of those 4 years she read 270 vampire novels, they look at her askance. The most common response is, "There are 270 vampire novels?" And the next response she gets from her friends is something like, "Well, those are 4 years of your life that you're never going to get back." So I have a confession. While I have not made a formal tally in the way that Adler has, I have read more vampire novels than I normally admit in polite company. It has easily been one of my go-to genres when I need a break from the more serious stuff. In all of the years that I have read these, however, I have never considered that they might offer a more serious reflection on culture or theology. For me, they have always just been fun. But a few books have changed my mind on this. Adler's Vampires Are Us, understanding our love affair with the immortal dark side, is one of them. And Eric Nuzum's The Dead Travel Fast, stalking vampires from Nosferatu to Count Chocula, is another. Nuzum writes, if you want to understand any moment in time or any cultural moment, just look at their vampires. His thesis is that vampires reflect the cultural fears, struggles, and challenges of their era. The classic example of this is probably Count Dracula. In a very real way, the minister from Transylvania was right. Dracula is ours and not theirs. The novel was written at a time when Eastern Europeans were arriving in Britain in great numbers. Xenophobia was rampant in Britain at that time. Dracula, the aristocratic vampire who emigrates on a boat carrying a coffin of soil, coffin of Transylvanian soil, was the perfect vehicle for portraying Western European and later American fears of immigrants. The novel performs what might be called the classic function of the vampire, which is to display a culture's fear of the other. And whether it is women or gay men or ethnic minorities, the literature has often held up a tidy mirror showing us our prejudices and biases. I think the literature is changing, however. It's true that the vampire sometimes still represents our culture's discomfort with the other. But certain other themes have become paramount in current novels. The Strain by Chuck Hogan and Guillermo del Toro. I see some smiles out there. Some people have read this or are familiar, which has now been made into a series on FX. Introduces some of the nastiest vampires in literature. These are not the pretty, romantic vampires of the Twilight saga. They don't even have Dracula's aristocratic sophistication. Instead, they are hairless and disfigured and unthinking. The novel begins as more and more of them are appearing throughout the city of New York. There's something wrong with my husband, the fearful woman says, leading the Center for Disease Control out to the shed. That's a line that never means anything good in vampire literature. The woman's husband had locked himself in the shed and wrote a note to his wife asking her not to let him out. Something terrible is happening to me, he said. And as the authorities open the shed and shine a light inside, we see the yellow eyes of a bald and pale creature hunched over. It seems to look at them quizzically. And then it raises its head and unhinges its lower jaw, which reveals layer upon layer of jagged teeth. They slam the door shut just before it lunges. We soon learn that a virus that turns people into vampires has been unleashed. It was released by Sardu, the oldest and most powerful vampire. He possesses absolutely no empathy and views vampires beneath him as his pawns. The humans in the story for Sardu are even lower down than that. Before unleashing the virus, Sardu makes a Faustian pact with one of the wealthiest men on Earth. The billionaire offers to facilitate the spread of the virus for the gift of eternal life. Neither the vampire nor the man have any care for those who are affected by their actions. And while I do not want to give away too much, because I'm sure that you're all dying to run out and read this now, I can say this. Power, in the end, is the Achilles heel of both vampire and billionaire in the story. Their belief in their own omnipotence and invincibility is what finally does them in. So what cultural fears does the strain represent? I think it is the fear of what we are doing to one another and to the planet. As Whitley Strieber, author of The Hunger, put it, today we are the vampires and our prey is the planet. This is actually a surprising twist on viewing the vampire as representative of our fears. For rather than simply being a terrifying other to us, the strain asks us to interrogate our own conscience and find the vampire within. In the age of late capitalism, where the clothes that we wear to the cars that we drive have troubling, if unseen, implications, we might do well to consider the place of these vampires within us and hopefully do something about it. The shift towards viewing the vampire as a part of us occurred probably about the time of the 1970s. And with this shift, not only have authors made human actions look quite a bit more vampiric in their novels, but they have also made the vampires a lot more human. For Anne Rice and for others, vampires are no longer just representatives of terror, but rather protagonists with surprisingly tender and human concerns. And this is, of course, the strain being exempted from that. They're not that in the strain, but they are that in a lot of other novels. And this is especially true when it comes to common human experiences of loneliness and ostracism. Despite the fact that they have supernatural abilities such as flight and improbable strength and immortality, vampires are the ultimate outsiders. They are scorned and they are hated by society. They are portrayed often as complicated loners, alternately despising company and explicitly craving it. They represent a yearning to belong when one feels alone and vulnerable. My favorite vampire novel is easily Let the Right One In by John Ajvide Lindqvist, known as the Swedish Stephen King. Let the Right One In begins with Oscar. Oscar is a fearful 12-year-old who is tormented by bullies in school. His father, an aloof addict, shows up in his life only occasionally. And his mother loves him, but alternates between being a distant figure who has to work all of the time and being an overclinging helicopter parent who wants Oscar to remain a child. One night, in the dead of winter, Oscar is alone outside, standing by a rusted metal play structure that is covered in snow, with only the faint light of distant street lamps illuminating the scene. He pretends to defend himself against bad guys. "What are you doing?" Ellie asks, who seems to have come out of nowhere. She looks to be about his age, perched on the play structure behind him. Oscar turns, startled, and notices right away that Ellie is not like other girls. She is sitting there in a t-shirt and jeans with no shoes on, despite the fact that the temperature is in the single digits. "Aren't you cold?" he asks. "No," she replies. "Why not?" "I guess I've forgotten how to." Oscar soon discovers Ellie's secret, that she is a 200-year-old vampire. And in the course of their relationship, Oscar is inspired by Ellie. She's even more of an outsider than he is, and yet she owns it. While Oscar hates his outsider status, Ellie accepts hers as a fact. And with Ellie's help, Oscar works up the courage to confront his bullies at school. You see him grow as a character and as a person. And surprisingly, the aloof Ellie begins to soften with Oscar. While she had allowed herself to be used by humans in the past in order to have her needs met, with Oscar she enters into a relationship of mutuality and trust. Now, you may note that vampire lore says that the vampire must be invited in or else she cannot cross the threshold. Let the right one in is a play on that superstition, but also a suggestion that letting the right ones into our lives is how we grow and change. By letting the right ones in, Ellie and Oscar strike a very human balance between vulnerability and strength, mutuality with others, and self-assertion. I feel like I owe you a caveat. Despite my intent, I think I have made the strain and let the right one in sound like earnest, heartwarming tales about environmentalism and growing up. They are not. They have dark and sinister themes, and if you choose to read them, don't say I haven't warned you. I'm not going to be asking Elise anytime soon to add these to the book groups list. Nonetheless, I stand by my decision to preach this oddball sermon. At the end of her wonderful book, Margot Adler says something that captures my feelings on this subject. She reminds us that vampires have no reflections when they look in mirrors. They don't have reflections because, she says, when they look through the mirror, we are staring back. They are nothing but our reflections. Vampires tell us something of our cultural fears, of our yearning for power and our potential to abuse it, of our status as outsider and our comfort with our own vulnerability. Vampires are us. Which one we identify with and why tells us an awful lot about ourselves. And so, my spiritual companions, be sure to let the right one in. And happy Halloween.